So again, we're going to be talking about security compliance as source code and basically try and see if we can, kind of do and solve the problem a little bit. So one thing we did at Adobe primarily before we went on this journey was to create something which we called internally as a Common Controls Framework, and in short, CCF. And basically, you'll be hearing a lot about common controls across the industry now if you're associated with security compliance in any way. But when we started this journey in 2012, 2013, there weren't too many frameworks out there. So we basically decided to create something that would work for our engineering, product, and security teams, and that teams could resonate with. And anytime we had to go and achieve a new certification, we didn't have to go and repeat all of the requirements. So that was step one, was to build a unified common controls framework. So the next 2 minutes, I'm going to just quickly breeze through, what that means, what's the kind of work we did, and just move on from there. Most of you should already be aware of Adobe. So basically, this is just a quick snapshot of the organization. So we primarily have 3 marquee products. I mean, we have much more, but these are ones that we are most famous for out there in the industry. We have the Creative Cloud, which is your Photoshops, the Lightrooms, and all the goodness that comes with Creative Suite. We have the Document Cloud, which is, Adobe Sign, PDF, and a lot of the folks in the industry out there use it. And then finally, we have the Experience Cloud, which is our business suite of, marketing and other solutions to basically help promote the enterprise marketing space. So with that, this is a lot of clicking. Yeah. So with the common controls, one thing what we did was we created something which was known as, when we first started, talking about this problem, we basically had something which we called as the compliance soup. So back in 2012, 2013, as Adobe was migrating towards the cloud, there were a lot of questions on how do we basically meet with regulatory and security compliance topics such as SOC 2, ISO, any other certifications such as FedRAMP and others. And what we famously called back then, internally was the compliance soup. Like, how do we go meet with access, change management, and a lot of these good requirements, and go talk to engineers without them basically, getting upset with us and trying to make sure that the organization complies with a lot of this. So the concept of the CCF was we took about 2,500 or 3,000 industry requirements, which you see on the left. We built a magic funnel internally, and then that funnel basically just distilled out about 300, 350 crisp requirements that we had that we could basically go back to engineering teams with, and product teams and security teams, and say, okay, if you want to meet with ISO or SOC or FedRAMP, this is that one crisp requirement you need on access, or this is the one crisp requirement you need on configuration management or change management. So we started with kind of creating a lot of these requirements in a manner that engineering and operations teams and product teams could understand easily, versus just giving them a raw transcript of the framework and saying, go decipher this yourself and go and implement it. So we started kind of doing a lot of that translation. We started building those common controls, and we went from about 2,500 to about 350, 400 requirements. And in 2018, we basically open sourced that framework as well, so that our peers in the industry could actually leverage that. And as they were building their own common controls, we just wanted to share that common knowledge and that goodness so others could also use it. So from there, we basically, what we did is we devised a baseline, which was, okay, what do we do to meet with SOC 2, ISO, PCI, and others? And what we did is we built an incremental roadmap. So we said, if you have the baseline level set of controls, which was about 100, 140 controls, you automatically can, try and, achieve a SOC 2 and an ISO, and within SOC 2 security, availability, and confidentiality particularly. And then obviously there's privacy and others too, but, and then we kind of tagged on ISO 27001, 17, 18, and a few other frameworks, and we built that as a baseline. So then, as with Adobe, we accept payment card data on our creative site, or on Adobe.com. So if there were certain products or services that required payment card workflows to be enabled, and making sure that we meet with PCI DSS requirements. So what we did is we just added on those 10 or 20 additional controls instead of having that product team go through the entire space of controls, because we'd already established that baseline. So at that point, it was an additional 20. Then some of our government cloud solutions were required to meet with the stringent requirements of FedRAMP moderate. So we're like, okay, we have the baseline, we have these core set of controls. This is an additional 40 or additional 50 that we need to kind of meet with our Gov Cloud obligations. So we kind of started to continue build on that and build that muscle memory, and basically have those inherent controls and those extra controls that we had to build. So from there, we basically reached a level of maturity where there was any new industry framework, we would rationalize it, we would take it through our magic funnel, build the common controls, and make sure that we were complying with them consistently across various parts of the business units. Once we achieved that state, we obviously wanted to see what can we do next. And we started going and reaching out to our engineering communities internally as well as externally. And one thing we often heard about was challenges with ongoing effectiveness of compliance and how do you kind of go meet with that. So our security and our engineering teams were spending anywhere between 40 to 80 hours a quarter trying to meet with the quarterly compliance obligations or these compliance obligations that are repetitive once you get the certification requirements. So the big challenge in front of us was how can we streamline that and make that easier given that we've already kind of built this framework around common controls. So what we did is we basically started thinking of compliance as source code or as code and started building these requirements on an engineering front and trying to see what can we do to kind of implement these early into the life cycle instead of it being an afterthought, and then also trying to see how we can reduce compliance fatigue, which is often the term used in the industry, by taking away the need of screenshots for evidence and kind of building more completeness and accuracy in our checks, rather than having an engineer go and take like 50 screenshots of a source code repository or of an access management tool, but rather writing like source code checks that they could basically run scripts off. Our internal platform could pull that off, and then we could use that and supply that as evidence for an auditor. So the way we thought about this was we had a threefold vision. The first one was, what can we do to reduce compliance fatigue? The second one was, what can we do to bring near real-time dashboards? So one thing when you're in the security compliance space, there's always these concept of audits. Now, audits are usually like point in time, and you basically have either your internal audit team or internal assessment team, and then your external audit team that comes, and then obviously in certain cases does a look back, and in other cases does a point in time testing. But by the time the audit is conducted, it's usually it could be anywhere between a 2-month to a 4-month exercise. Well, guess what? If there was a risk that was introduced because of a control failure, that risk had continued to exist for that duration of time. So our goal was, what can we do to build near real-time dashboards? So as and when a control is failing, engineering and product teams and security teams have easy access to those control failures, and they're able to kind of detect those earlier into the life cycle instead of waiting for a manual audit to happen. And the last aspect was, how can we self-service a lot of these requirements and move to complete control automation? So one of our goals was to make sure that if an engineering team today, understands that they have a use case around sensitive personal data or, health data, then they should be able to self-service a lot of those requirements and the controls instead of waiting for a team to come to them and kind of explain to them what the gaps are. And those gap exercises would take anywhere between 8 to 16 hours to even longer, depending on the use case. Instead of that, we kind of started building modules internally where an engineering team could come in, they could self-service, they could put in what their use case was, their business case was. Obviously, we do have a little bit of manual intervention at that point to really extrapolate on the business use case, but then they'll be able to generate tickets and they'll be able to generate their list of controls that they need to implement with clear and crisp guidance on how to do that. So we had 4 stages during this journey. The first stage was, how do we build a data catalog? Because with any of this work that's required, and if you need a platform to come and talk to you and to talk to your engineering and product teams, the platform needs to know who to go talk to. So the first one was, how do we build a data catalog? And at Adobe, we've always had a level of like a product catalog and a data catalog, but then we had to make sure that it spoke to our automation platform or our internal platform. And how can we make sure that that data could be leveraged when a code-based check is being run? And if it identifies, say, a control failure, which product team does it need to go to? Which cloud account does it need to hit? And then where does the ticket or the corresponding alert in a dashboard needs to be created? So the first thing we did is we created a data catalog that could speak to our internal compliance platform. Our step 2 was, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these activities are annual or they are, longer time based. So what we did is we started, kind of dissecting these activities into more quarterly or more real-time activities. So for example, we created something which is called quarterly compliance reviews. So instead of doing a lot of these reviews on an annual basis, we started doing them like quarterly or even lesser to make sure that we were able to kind of build these into repetitive tasks that can be provided. Once we basically did that, our stage 3 was to build more self-service modules, which was to make sure that platform and engineering teams can easily leverage a lot of this information readily by themselves and be able to kind of leverage them while they were building the product and not as an afterthought after they built the product to come and talk to the compliance team. And the last stage was obviously moving from a completely manual effort to a state of automation where a lot of these checks and these notifications can be built into a rules engine that we can take forward to the product team. So with that, architecturally, this is a quick visualization of how we went about this. So we had some shift left activities as well, where we were kind of building them into the product team's, backlog and when they were building the code instead of coming as an afterthought. But then we built a whole automation platform where what we did is we had these 4 layers. The first layer was obviously the infrastructure layer, which was, okay, how can we build a platform that can speak to engineering teams and their systems and be able to kind of leverage information? The second layer was the integration layer. So we had a lot of these security solutions and solutions that engineering teams use today. Our goal was that our platform can actually talk to them rather than to talk to the engineering teams and get manual screenshots, to be able to build integrations to a lot of these solutions and be able to pull in data as needed for compliance and audit reviews. The third layer, which was the most important layer, is what we call the rules engine. So we started building rules within the source code to be able to kind of leverage a lot of this data, articulate it with the data catalog, and whenever there was a rule failure, it would basically just identify that rule failure, and then it would pop up as a notification into the 4th layer, which is the visualization layer. So once the visualization layer would catch on to something, it would relay that information back to the engineering teams. Mostly it was detective control in some ways. In some cases, it could also be a preventive control. So depending on the nature of the control, you could build the platform in that manner. So here is just another illustration. So as you can see, when we have our the product team, control area or the product team environment, you have a lot of these checks that we need from a compliance perspective, whether that's configuration management, change management, a lot of that. What that translates into is more vulnerability scanning, more pen tests, getting access logs and getting other logs. We were able to pull all of this data, build it into a source code based platform, be able to get a lot of that back, build a data catalog that can speak to a lot of these checks to identify where the platform failure is happening or the failure is happening, make it talk to a rules engine, which would identify when a rule would be triggered that would cause that. And then finally, through our log aggregation solution and our ticketing solution, be able to relay a lot of that information back into a streamlined, visualized dashboard. So with that, we were able to kind of take out a lot of the need for manual evidences or repetitive exercises that we unfortunately had to have our engineering teams do in the past, but make it more code-driven and basically be able to help them, give them crucial hours back so they can continue to build the great products that they always do. So here are some, visualizations of how our engineering teams see our platform today. So when they have to go and do access reviews, they no longer have to go to like multitude of systems. All of that is linked into a system that they can basically easily leverage. They don't have to go take manual screenshots. They see I think PDF, Google is messing up the view, but basically they see a list of all users. The users, of course, has been redacted, but you'll see their, various access rights, and you will see everything there. They simply have to go and just perform the access review right within the platform itself. Because of the integrations, it relays this information back to various systems, and those changes happen where needed. And in a lot of cases, and what they have to do is because it's a quarterly exercise or more repetitive, over time, they don't even have to do this exercise because the tool automatically does a diff for them, identifies what those changes are, shares a summary. They simply have to attest to it in certain cases, saying that this is good, and then it can go and perform the changes as needed. So moving on, another thing that was very apparent during the pandemic was, a lot of our customers and even in the industry, everyone wanted to find out, like, how are you more resilient? Like, what happens if, unfortunately, one of the geos has an issue? And, we always thought about issues as like fires and earthquakes and other aspects of calamities, but no one ever, like with the pandemic, it was just more widespread. It was across all geo, across the world, and everybody was going through the same challenges, and we continue to brace them a little bit even today. So with that, we started getting a lot of questions on how are you, performing your resilient activities such as business impact assessments, disaster recovery exercises, and others. So what we did is we went from a manual, effort where teams would come in, they would perform their impact assessments manually. So we built like an in-house platform again. We built some checks into the platform. So as teams were defining during their BIA, say their recovery time objective or your recovery point objective, when they were doing actual DR drills, the platform would be able to kind of ask them those values and be able to tell them, nope, you already defined something on your business impact assessment and your actual recovery exercise took longer. So it does those automatic calculations itself and then points those out. It also defines a list of critical vendors that the other teams can then leverage for, say, vendor risk management and other areas. So we've been trying to kind of holistically capture a lot of that data and make it, be able to communicate with one another so this data can be repetitive versus like when you go into manual evidence gathering, it's all a lot of screenshot based, it's all manual and cannot be repurposed year over year. So our goal was to basically capture this data, make it talk to various systems so that, we have one consistent set of data source that we can leverage for a lot of our activities. So with that, given that we are coming close to time, I did want to share some resources. We have our open source framework. As I said, you're more than welcome to leverage it or at least take a look. We've written a few blogs on our automation journey, so feel free to kind of go through those. But with that, I'd love to, since I said it's going to be more conversation-based, thought-provoking based, so I'd love to hear questions or if anyone has any, and we'll get our steps up.
All right, so I'm going to run around with a mic. I see one person with their hand up. If you have questions, please put your hand up, and I will come around to you. Hold on one second. I want to make sure I get you on the mic.
Yeah. So how does CCF compare to, say, NIST 853? Because that's what we're doing right now, basically using that as a common framework as we go along, getting like, FedRAMP and StateRAMP and such.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if anybody couldn't hear the question was how does CCF compare to NIST 853? So as I said at the start of my talk, there are a lot of firstly, common controls out there. So when we started in 2012, there weren't too many out there. But, when we built our framework, obviously NIST 853 has been ever present and is one of the gold standards to leverage. So definitely a good idea to leverage that. Even when we were building a common controls framework, we did take that as one of the inputs. And, Rev 4 is what a lot of the organizations use today for FedRAMP moderate and higher, but obviously with Rev 5 coming in, you will see some changes there, but it's a good idea to leverage that. And we also did leverage this as one of our inputs into our common controls.
Next question is first row in the middle.
So I noticed a lot of the applications you were talking about are basically management of people and business practices more than management of actual requirements. Like when you say compliance as code, I'm thinking of OpenSCAP or compliance frameworks where you literally run them against the technology and it tells you whether or not it passes the tests. Can you tell us more about what you did at Adobe related to that?
Yeah, so that's basically where the rule engine comes in, and that's more for our internal assessment team. So when we are actually running these exercises and these audits, instead of going and manually kind of attesting to those evidences and reviewing them, we basically are able to pull that data from our rules engine and kind of make it run through it and to be able to tell us where those control failures are. And then also for the engineering teams, as I said, one of our goals is to get them a near real-time dashboard. So those checks are constantly running. Teams have access to it. So the data that we see is what the product teams and engineering teams see. So if they're kind of deploying an insecure configuration or something else else that does not mean the sense of an operating effectiveness of a control, they are able to get access to that, immediately as well. So some of the examples I shared were more on the access review and those sites, because that's where it's a lot of pain and fatigue for teams, and they have to kind of do those repetitively, and it's never fun. But then we do have certain rule engine, and we are kind of trying to mature it as we go to build more use cases where we can get that out up front before even an assessment starts.
Next question is right in front of you in the front row.
Yeah, I love this whole concept, but like my first question is like, what other GRC tools, for example, have like the automated API stuff where they can pull a lot of data in, and like, why didn't you use like some off-the-shelf GRC? And then do you guys specifically, did you create your own? With that being said, and then did you guys use like the security matrix in order to figure out how to cross all these particular compliances? And then with that being said, do you guys do your compliance back to back to back to back, so you don't have to gather so much more evidence versus putting them out through the entire year?
Yeah, so there were a lot of questions, so I'll try and remember all of them, but if I did skip any, feel free to kind of repeat. So I think the first one was, did we look at off-the-shelf solutions? We absolutely did, and when we first started our journey, we were leveraging a GRC solution internally as we were part of the internal audit group. We were leveraging, a GRC solution, but one thing we noticed is, again, nothing against any GRC solution out there. I'm sure there are use cases that it works for. In our use case, our biggest, constraint that we had was, kind of trying to keep up with organizational changes and making sure that the data continues to stay rich and relevant, and that's something that we saw as a huge shortcoming when we were kind of working with those solutions. And the other thing was, we would go to these engineering teams with those solutions, and they would tell us, why do we have to go to now a third platform or a fourth platform or a fifth platform to do the work that we do? Why can't you bake something with our own ticketing solution and our own source code management solution and others? And that's where we saw certain constraints when we were doing that, and we decided that, okay, building from scratch and leveraging, so when we built the common controls framework, we built something that was called driver subscribers. So what we did is, we had driver teams out there that we felt confident in their control implementation, and we asked the rest of the companies to subscribe to those driver controls. Once that was done, we felt more confident as we were building these checks and balances to rely on the data that these driver teams were capturing and then relay it back. So that's one of the reasons why we didn't go off the shelf, but obviously we continue to evaluate that, and if there's a solution that would work for our engineering and platform and product teams, we would absolutely love to leverage it. But in the meanwhile, we continue to build on ours to bring in more efficiency and scalability, because obviously we can build our modules a lot faster.
Last question is up to your right. Got one more up here to your right.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi. Great talk, by the way. Thank you. My question is around the rules engine. I'm sure Adobe is a very big company, and you have different systems having different compliance requirements. So how does the rule engine account for such different systems? And do you let your compliance analysts or engineers modify those rules as per changing landscapes?
Okay, great question, by the way. Thank you. So we do, obviously, Adobe is a big enough organization where there is a little bit of, different implementations, as you would say. But as I was referring to the gentleman here, one thing, before we even went on this journey was the whole driver subscriber approach, where we wanted to make sure that we had mostly centralized a way a control is implemented, and then encouraging these teams to kind of adopt that. And one easy conversation to do that was like, hey, we have this driver control and we feel fairly confident in this, but if we saw a pushback from an engineering team, it was just a sit-down conversation to make them realize, if you don't inherit this goodness, you have to go and perform your own security monitoring, which means these extra 20 controls. And guess what? No one loves these extra compliance activities. So a lot of that journey was streamlined. But to your point, there are always that one-off use cases that continue to exist. So we are tweaking our rules engine as we go, but we are going after that 80% or 90% so that there is more scalability and flexibility. And for the odd 10%, sometimes either we default to a manual review, or we basically eventually build a roadmap for the team to move over to the central process, but it can never be perfect.
I'm still curious to learn about your thought process for building the CCF.
I'm so sorry, but we are actually over time at this point. So for folks who have additional questions, yeah, you're welcome to take them outside. And one final round of applause. Thank you so much for our speaker.
Thank you.